Good morning. Maybe this is a quite old CV because I moved from 5 years to Spain. I'm currently working in Barcelona. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, but also for giving me the opportunity to be back in Chennai after almost 20 years. So I hope to visit the city and see if something has changed. When we speak about glycemic variability, I think that we have to think a little bit. These are original data developed several years ago by John Garrick at the Mayo Clinic when continuous glucose monitoring was at the beginning. You see here, this study included 9 type 1 diabetic patients with a wonderful glycated hemoglobin. 6.7% of A1C in type 1 diabetes, I believe, is almost the dream of any diabetologist. So we can be more than happy to have this kind of a glucose control. However, when we perform the glucose monitoring, this was the result. Despite a very good A1C level, the glycemic variability over the day in these patients was so huge, and of course we cannot be really satisfied about this kind of control. When we speak about glycemic variability, we would like to have a marker, something that can help us to understand or to measure easily the glycemic variability. Unfortunately, you can see here, there are a lot of different markers, any of them just showing an aspect of the problem. There are some strengths, some weakness of each of them. However, honestly, I believe, according to my friend Louis Monnier, who is mainly a mathematician, that MAGE could be considered the most attractive marker in order to measure glycemic variability. I will be back later on this concept. The first guy looking at glycemic variability impact on type 1 diabetes was my friend Eric Patrick from Hull. He had the possibility to access to the DCCT database, and in 2006 he published that glycemic instability is not a predictor of microvascular complications in the DCCT. However, 2 years later, he looked at the same database and he went out with the 2 different results. First, he published that the median daily glucose, as well as pre- and postprandial hyperglycemia, are predictors for cardiovascular disease in the same cohort of the DCCT. And after, also that A1C instability is a predictor of a microvascular complication in the same cohort. So he was able to show that some instability of glucose, of glycemia over the DCCT predicted the development of both macro and microvascular complications. And I believe that this is a key paper just published a few years ago. Why? Because for the first time, it was shown that A1C instability measured as a standard deviation of A1C over the time in this huge cohort of type 1 diabetes predicted a microstructural integrity, a microstructural damage in the youth with type 1 diabetes. So just suggesting that when glucose goes up and down, you have a real brain damage in young people. Of course, this can impact on the cognitive development of these children. And almost 3 years ago, it also was published that evidence suggests that glycemic variability may be associated with autonomic imbalance in patients with both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So we have evidence that glucose variability can also impact on neuropathy development. The first guy publishing about glucose variability in type 2 diabetes was Michele Muggeo from Verona. He had a very huge database, and he showed that an instability of fasting glucose over years, let's say in 10 years, can predict a worsened prognosis for both total mortality and cardiovascular mortality. And let me say that the science as well, medicine, is quite strange, because this paper, this kind of evidence was there till 2012. Nobody else was looking at this kind of evidence, when this database coming from Taiwan, including more than 5,000 patients, they were able to confirm that the fasting glycemic instability predicts a worse outcome in terms of cardiovascular disease. And more recently, the same results were coming out from the advance. When all the patients of the advance were pooled all together, and the effect of glycemic variability in terms of A1C variability was examined, it went out that A1C variability is positively associated with the risk of macrovascular events, while glucose variability was associated with both macro and macrovascular events. I believe this, honestly, is really a milestone in this story of glucose variability, because the advance is a controlled trial. So for the first time, we have the evidence not only from epidemiological point of view, but also coming out from a randomized controlled trial. So suggesting that it's true, glucose variability can impact on diabetic complications. And also, last year was published that the A1C variability associated with the chronic clinical disease and cardiovascular disease in this huge cohort in Hong Kong. It also was indicated that a standard deviation of glucose over time predicted a worse prognosis for cardiovascular disease. More recently, let's say 2 years ago, again, A1C variability has been associated with the incidence of diabetic nephropathy in type 2 diabetes, and you know that liver disease is increasing in interest in type 2 diabetes. And evidence also suggests that glucose variability is associated with the liver fibrosis in type 2 diabetes. And let me say that glucose variability is not just a matter of diabetes. I'm just showing one of the most recent papers on this topic, but many papers are confirming that the glucose variability impacts in worsening the prognosis in any kind of acute diseases. You have evidence from the surgeries, from orthopedics, for infections. So it seems that when the glucose goes up and down, honestly, something is not good for the patient. Which mechanism can explain this? You know that our group and the Michael Brownlee group were widely involved in the story of oxidative stress and diabetic complications. We were able to show, according to Michael Brownlee, that when glucose was up at the mitochondrial level, a huge amount of free radicals are produced, leading to activation of several pathways involved in diabetic complications in one side, while this is mainly the work of Brownlee, our group was more involved in showing that the same pathway also is involved in inducing an endothelial dysfunction, which of course contributes to diabetic complication development. We were the first, many years ago, to suggest a new design to study glucose variability in vitro. We cultured the human endothelial cells in constant normal glucose, in constant high, or in intermittent glucose, and honestly, we were quite surprised to see that, high glucose damaged the endothelial cells, but when the glucose was going up and down, this was even more evident, so the damage was higher. And also we were able to confirm that mainly this was related to the overgeneration of free radicals. These are two markers of free radical generation, and this is the way to show that stopping glucose free radical generation in different ways, we were able to control the situation. Now, honestly, how can we explain that when glucose goes up and down is more dangerous than constant high glucose, particularly thinking that when you expose the cells for 2 weeks to continuous 20 millimolar of the glucose, you expose the cells to higher amount of glucose than going up and down for 2 weeks from 5 to 20. The total amount is really different. How can we explain? And I'm really glad to show some still unpublished data, the paper has just been submitted, which can contribute to explain why this happens. Because of course, when the cells are exposed to high glucose and the oxidative stress is generated, the cells react. They react increasing the own intracellular antioxidant defenses. This is a very general mechanism of defense against free radicals. And you see here, when the cells are exposed to high glucose, you have a huge increase of SOD. These are not, the SOD2 and catalase do not significantly move. Even you see they move. However, GPX in constant high glucose increases. So at the end, the cells react, increasing mainly SOD1 and GPX in order to protect themselves. What happens in oscillating when glucose goes up and down? SODs increase, but GPX does not react. GPX is not stimulated. And we were able to show that this probably is related to the overactivation of microRNA 185, which specifically target GPX expression. In other words, SOD increases because MR146A is increased in both conditions, constant and oscillating. However, when the glucose is going up and down, only the MR185 is increased, so downregulating GPX expression. So it seems an interesting target and also an interesting way to understand why oscillating glucose could be more dangerous than constant high glucose. What about the clinical evidence? But this is the pivotal study published by Louis Monnier. It showed that in type 2 diabetic patients, there is an increased excretion of isoprostan, so confirming that in type 2 diabetes, there is an increased generation of free radicals. And he measured MAGE in these patients. This is the meaning of a MAGE. When glucose goes up and down, if you measure this kind of variability, the total expression of this, the marker of this is MAGE. And he found that only MAGE predicted the level of isoprostan. So suggesting that in vivo, when glucose goes up and down, there is a huge generation of free radicals. And we confirm this in a more, let me say, sophisticated way, because we clamped the glycemia for 24 hours at 15 millimole liter or at 10, or we went up and down from 5 to 15. Why? Why this kind of a design? This was the peak value, but the most important evidence is coming from evaluating the effect of a constant high 10 with going up and down. Why? Because if you clamp glycemia at 10 for 24 hours, or you go up and down from 5 to 15, you infuse in 24 hours exactly the same amount of glucose, only in a different way, constantly high or going up and down. And you see that after 24 hours, when glucose was going up and down, the effect of endothelial function was more dangerous, and also in terms of oxidative stress generation. But let me say that the most convincing evidence that glucose variability is dangerous is coming from study in healthy controls. In this study, glycemia was monitored continuously for 1 month. The people were taking the device for 1 month continuously. In normal people, glycemia never goes up 140 or down 70 milligram deciliter. So suggesting that if in normal people, glycemia is always in a so strict narrow range, my simple, naive explanation is that otherwise it's dangerous. I do not have another explanation. This, in my opinion, is the most important evidence that the glucose variability can be dangerous. However, when we speak about glucose variability, honestly, we pay more attention to the peaks. But glucose variability also means hypoglycemia. And evidence, several papers, this is one of them, are showing that higher is the variability, higher is the risk for hypoglycemia. And hypoglycemia today, we know that it is something more dangerous than just a side effect. It can condition any acute disease, but also favoring the development of complications. Several years ago, in this paper, the effect of rescue hypoglycemia with normal glucose or high glucose was evaluated in neurons, in cells, or in rats. What they were able to show was that when the hypoglycemia was rescued, was recovered, producing a hyperglycemia, the degree of superoxide production and neuronal death increased with increasing glucose concentration during the perfusion period after hypoglycemia. So suggesting that when you recover from hypo, producing a hyper, there is a degeneration of an ischemia reperfusion effect, which is well known in cardiology. We performed this study. We induced hypoglycemia in both controls or in type 1 diabetes, and we recovered from hypo producing normoglycemia. And you see here that after hypo, the endothelial function was reduced, and when we produced normoglycemia, there was a rescue, even requiring some hours to be recovered. However, when hypoglycemia was followed by hyperglycemia, the effect was very deleterious on endothelial function. The endothelial function was worsened, meaning that when you go up and down from hypo to hyper, this is very, very dangerous for our patients. What can we do? Because clearly this is not acceptable today. We have evidence, epidemiological evidence, that this can be very dangerous for our patients. However, when we intervene on glucose variability, it's not enough to simply cut any kind of a glycemia. Because if from these levels you go down, you simply produce more hypoglycemia. So the therapeutic approach must be not simply to control of hyperglycemia, but must be to avoid variability, to avoid the fluctuation. Otherwise, you have more risk to induce hypoglycemia. Does this pay? We have a preliminary evidence. In this trial, which was published in the first part is published in Diabetes Care, showing that it's true that variability induces oxidative stress and endothelial function. However, after several months, the authors were able to show that controlling variability, more you control variability, more you are able to control IMT progression, which of course is just a surrogate marker, but we know that is a very good marker to assess the risk for cardiovascular events. So what is the message? The final message? That to be a specialist in diabetes is more and more challenging, because we were happy to learn that controlling glycemia can prevent complications. Then somebody was showing that we have to intervene very early to avoid the metabolic memory. After this, somebody suggested, oh, maybe you have to control even postprandial hyperglycemia because it's a specific role in producing complications. Now, we have evidence that we have to avoid also glycemic variability, and finally, all this avoiding hypoglycemia. So in other words, we just say, if you want to avoid the complications, you have to have a glycemia in your patients like a normal people, which of course is very easy to get, no? I'm sure that all your patients are having normal glycemia at any time of their life. I'm of course joking, but this is the current challenge of diabetes therapy, is to try to maintain our patients as long as possible in the normal glycemia, and particularly, as I hope to convince you, to avoid variability and fluctuation in glucose, because also this can be dangerous for them. Thank you. Thank you very much.